Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Green Fund's tentatively titled CannaCast, where we will be speaking to people within and adjacent to the growing global cannabis industry. My name is Louis, and I'm also the manager of the Green Fund website, which covers all of the latest cannabis news and financial and investment information. Having said that, our first guest may seem a little left field. He's someone I've been a fan of for many, many years, but whose work admittedly centers upon psychedelic substances more than it does cannabis. Though I chose this guest because as I see the war on drugs coming to an end, and cannabis is clearly positioned at the forefront of that change, I don't think this change will stop at cannabis. We're already seeing the rise in the exploration of MDMA and psilocybin-assisted therapies to treat things like PTSD and depression. This is something I believe will continue further into the future. And as such, I thought it would be prudent to speak with none other than Dennis McKenna, the ethnopharmacologist, lecturer, and the author of the book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, which chronicles his relationship with his brother, the late Terence McKenna, a revered psychedelic lecturer. As I mentioned, Dennis's work is centered more around psychedelics, and so we don't touch upon cannabis a great deal in this interview. However, he does provide very interesting insights into the ways in which we might integrate psychedelics into society moving forward, and also how we may have been using them throughout history. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy the first episode of the Green Fund's CannaCast, featuring none other than the legendary Dennis McKenna.
So, Dennis, how would you describe yourself? You're described as an author and a lecturer and an ethnopharmacologist, which is a bit of a mouthful. How would you describe your job role?
Authored some books and I lecture and give, seems like these days, endless podcasts. That's the new medium. But I am an ethnopharmacologist, whatever that means, and what it means to me, what ethnopharmacology means to me is there's a formal definition, but basically the interdisciplinary study of not always medicines, let's say biologically active substances that are used or observed in traditional cultures. So that kind of covers the basis for what ethnopharmacology is. I mean, it's a contraction of ethno, which means people, right? And pharmacology. But if we didn't make that distinction about traditional cultures, then everything we do would be ethnopharmacology, and in fact it is, but we don't usually talk about, the biomedical corporate pharmaceutical infrastructure as ethnopharmacology. I mean, yes, it's humans working with drugs, but my focus has always been on in the field kind of traditional cultures, or indigenous cultures, and that kind of thing. So,
what are some of the substances that you explore? What are some of the substances that have been used in these contexts?
Well, the field of ethnopharmacology, extends to a great variety of substances. They're not always about psychoactive substances. I mean, ethnopharmacology would include, for example, the study of arrow poisons, which is quite an advanced technology in some cultures, or the study of fish toxins, or obviously the study of medicinal plants and fungi. But of course, my specialty has been in the psychedelic plants, the hallucinogens. That's been what my work has been, but that certainly is not the limit of ethnopharmacology.
And what got you interested in psychedelics? Because as it is more popular now, it's certainly a niche in many respects, especially in a career sense. So what got you into it on a personal level and then on a career level?
On a personal level, and it was personal level that got me, personal interest that got me into it in the first place, back in the day when I was 18, 19, and that was actually the first year I discovered the word ethnopharmacology and decided to become one, and personally, my personal interests and my professional interests have sort of gone together. I did my thesis work on ayahuasca in South America when I was at the University of British Columbia, and another much more obscure psychedelic called ukuhe, which was it was an orally active tryptamine preparation that was used by the Witoto people, and it was made from Varrola, which is a member of the nutmeg family. There are many species of Varrola, and the sap, the bark of them, often contains very high levels of DMT and 5-methoxy-DMT. And Varrola is used in the form of snuffs. Many parts of the Amazon basin, particularly the Yanomami group and other groups, prepare it as a snuff. Prepare the dried powder of the sap of a tree as a snuff, which is taken as a snuff. So it passes by the whole inactivation mechanism in the gut, which is if you eat DMT or any of these short-acting tryptamines, except psilocybin, that's the main exception, but these things are not orally active. And so that's the thing, you have to inhibit monoamine oxidase in the gut in order to render DMT or 5-methoxy-DMT orally active. That's the basis of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is one of the components. The large liana, Banisteriopsis caapi, contains these beta-carboline alkaloids, which are very selective and potent monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And then there are various admixture plants, but primarily two that are used depending on their kind of geography, but they're admixture plants that contain DMT that are added into the preparation, and in this combination it becomes orally active. And the couple of the plants are Psychotria viridis, which is called chacruna, and is the traditional term, and the other one is Diploteris caberetiana, that is in the same family as ayahuasca, but ayahuasca itself contains beta-carbolines. Diploteris caberetiana contains DMT in the leaves, and not beta-carbolines, or not much beta-carboline. And then the ukuhe, and this was the basis of my thesis. Ukuhe is prepared from Varrola and usually taken as a snuff, but the Witoto and a couple of related tribes use it orally. They make an oral preparation out of it. So that was kind of the scope of my thesis, was you've got here two orally active tryptamine-based psychedelics, but from completely different botanical sources. And the question was, what is their mechanism? Are they the same? Are there beta-carbolines in Varrola or not? And do they share a common mechanism of action? So it was kind of a comparative look at these two things. And so that got me into ayahuasca. Before that, I was interested in mushrooms, and my brother and I wrote a book in 1975 called Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, which you may know about. Mm. We wrote under pseudonyms, and that was before I got into academics at all, or I guess I was in academics. I was headed that direction, but that work was definitely unofficial, unsanctioned. But when I did begin to think about going back to graduate school, I ended up when I started my graduate work at the University of British Columbia in 1979. Originally, I was going to work on psilocybin, and specifically, I was going to look at genetic regulation of psilocybin biosynthesis in isolating, characterizing the enzymes, and we didn't really have access to molecular biology techniques at that time, but that was the scope of of the project. But then I worked on that there for about a year, and then I got my supervisor suggested that I could maybe go to South America, and he had money to do that. So I said, so I bagged that project. I mean, to be honest, I was not getting very far with it, and I thought, this will be more chance to do more field work and so on. So I ended up going to South America, and that would be in sort of the start of 1981. And that's what I ended up working my thesis on. So that's how I ended up doing it. And in the course of, working with these plants, both psilocybin and ayahuasca, they became important to me personally, and still are, basically. I am very grateful to have a relationship with ayahuasca. I feel like it's the indigenous people have they often say these are teachers, these are plant teachers. And I think that's true. You learn a lot from them. So in that sense, they're teachers. We could argue about whether they have a spiritual, presence and so on, but they've been tremendous. I feel like I've learned a lot from them. And so they're teachers.
In that respect, and I've heard you call them teachers or allies before. Mm-hmm. I guess this is maybe a broad question, but why do you think psychedelics have the effect that they do? And not just on like a chemical level, but on a functional level. Why do humans get such a profound impact from things like psilocybin and like ayahuasca? Why do you think these drugs are here? Do you think there's a meaning at all? Or is it just chance?
All right. Well, no, I don't. I mean, in some way, everything is chance. Why are they here? That's the $64 question, or the $64 million question, or whatever. I think that why they're here, why they have their effect, these are, especially with respect to the tryptamines, these are derivatives of tryptophan, which is an amino acid found in every living thing, right? It's one of the 20 that goes into proteins, but tryptophan is, two trivial enzymatic steps away from DMT. And so DMT is actually quite common in the plant world and even the animal world. We have DMT in our brains, and there are lots of amphibians like toads that contain it. So the fact that the molecules are around is not too surprising. The surprising part is is the structures in our brain that it interacts with, the receptors in our brain. What is it about the human brain that it's through the course of evolution, these receptors have become important in the experiencing of what you might call mystical states or transcendent states. What is the value of transcendence for an evolving hominid? I mean, what is the use of having, these plants can reliably induce these very profound altered states, and I think many people have suggested that the idea of deity and all that probably originated out of these kinds of experiences. And I would go further than that and suggest that even language and the ability to form abstractions, to form, complex ideas where symbols and images and what's sometimes called portentousness or a sense of meaning are all inextricably bound together. And I think that in the sense that these things are teacher plants or teacher molecules, in a way they taught us early on in evolution in the process of kind of making, crossing that threshold from being a hominid, but not really a human yet. I think they taught us how to use our brains, they taught us how to teach, and they taught us how to essentially practice cognition, and link that to language and all that. And this idea is sometimes called the stoned ape theory. And and my brother wrote about this also in Food of the Gods, which you may have read. I've been rereading it. I've been asked to write a foreword for a new edition, so I've been rereading it. It's been about 30 years since I actually read it since it came out. I tell you, it reads very well still. It's extremely timely, and if you going back and taking a look at it, it's a very well-reasoned argument, and it probably is, it has some validity. I mean, it's hard to prove anything like this, and the stoned ape theory has been, as the media will tend to do, it's been, mocked in a certain way. Well, we, ate mushrooms and then we weren't monkeys anymore. We suddenly got smart, I don't think it worked that way, but I think that if you look at I think there's a factor of epigenetics involved, and if you look at the environments, essentially, at some point, hominids moved out of the rainforest. We were arboreal species, and we moved into the plains, and in the plains where much of our evolution took place, there were ungulate animals like antelopes and cattle-like animals and so on, and inevitably there would in fact have been psilocybe mushrooms because we know these areas were much wetter than they are now, where, in the Serengeti area. And we know from current conditions that pretty much anywhere in the warm tropics, anywhere there are pastures and cattle in the warm tropics, Psilocybe cubensis is going to show up, and it's not a hard mushroom to find. It's big and it's beautiful. It's golden or violet, and it's hard to ignore it, And in this environment, these hominids who were always scavenging for something to eat, basically, they could not have overlooked it. And when they did encounter it, then they would have had these experiences. And it's hard to know how long ago that took place, but it could have been a very long time ago. We can look at other evidence. It's like the further back you go, the more sparse the evidence becomes on a lot of levels, fossil evidence and so on. But we know enough from archaeology that hominids were able to control fire probably as long as 2 million years ago. I mean, there are archaeological sites where it's clear they were using fire, and using it to, roast animals and split the bones open and all this. These traces are there. So, and that doesn't happen really without intelligence, essentially, or the ability. I mean, I think the thing that sets the hominids aside, sets us aside from, as you know, we have these enormously expanded brains, and we also have opposable thumbs, so we have fine motor control and the ability to manipulate things in the environment. Those two things come together in us, in no other species that I'm aware of. I mean, there are evidences that, animals can use tools, primitive tools. They can use sticks to dig termites out of logs and this sort of thing. That's a big step from, building a computer or an atomic reactor or a starship, and, you can't do that. And, you know, it's more than just technology. I mean, we can point to technology, but we can also point to art and other types of creative expression. All of these arise out of the ability, I think, to have abstractions, to form abstractions, an imagination, essentially. And I think that's what mushrooms gave us. They gave us the ability to do this, to link meaningful symbols, meaningful visual context to meaningful sounds and to interpretations. So you know, I think, and of course, no one can know this, but so we can assert all we want. But I think that something that distinguishes humans from other animals is that we construct our own reality. You know, we live in a world that we have created, you know, in our heads. And, you know, the current phrase, the way they used to describe it, is sometimes called the default mode network these days. I prefer to call it the reality hallucination. You know, in a sense, in order to make sense of the world, you know, our brain has to construct a model of reality. And that's what we do. We live in a model of reality, which is one step removed from reality itself. And a lot of what the brain does is it filters things out, you know, because if everything came into your brain from external, you know, sensory receptors and so on, it would just be very confusing and overwhelming. So the brain's developed these neural gating mechanisms, the selective ability to filter things out that are not perceived as relevant to survival, and to construct this model that we inhabit, which reflects reality in some sense. We hope so, we think so, we can't actually know, because we're always in this you know, artificially created bubble of the model of the world that we live in. And one of the things that psychedelics do, one of the main things, maybe the most important thing that they do, is they temporarily disable that default mode or that model of reality. They demolish these neural gating mechanisms. They let you step outside your reference frame temporarily and look at your situation and look at the relation between, you know, the self and the world and everything else in the world from a completely different perspective. And, you know, and then that out of that arises this, you know, this psychedelically induced mystical experience, if you will. If you want to call it that, I mean, you know, I guess mystical experience implies religious experience. And usually there's some concept of deity or something involved, but you know, so maybe that's inaccurate, you know, because you can have a mystical experience, but it doesn't have to be necessarily you know, a feeling like you're encountering God, although many people do feel that. But you have to remember they're working out of probably a previous framework. But I think what these things taught us as we were evolving from monkeys to humans, essentially, was the notion that there is a hidden world, you know, or there's a world that transcends ours, that the world of everyday apprehension and so on, there's something beyond that. And the psychedelics were one way to actually step into that world temporarily, much as the same way we're still using them. You know, you're familiar with the literature of psychedelic experiences, psychedelic mystical experiences, and that's the idea that, you know, there is a world of meaning and profundity and connection far beyond what we normally experience in everyday life. And the notion that that we are all one, we're all connected, we're not really separate either from each other or from the rest of nature. And if you step back and look at that objectively, you have to sort of say, well, yeah, obviously. But if we were always walking around in that state, we wouldn't get a whole lot done, But the psychedelics are a tool that lets you revisit that and to reaffirm that. And I think, that's why these experiences are so meaningful to people. Even though, many people take lots of psychedelics and have these experiences, but, maybe they're slow learners. Maybe I'd put myself in that category because it's still interesting, but you can have one or two psychedelic experiences in your lifetime, and it will have a lifelong impact on you. Even if you never go back to it, you've sort of peeked behind the curtain and seen what's really there, and it's going to change the way you look at everything. So I think they're very useful in that sense, for exploring consciousness in that respect, but then they're also therapeutically useful for the same reason. They give you a chance to step away from your being and look at your existential situation from a different perspective. And so you can look at things like trauma and addiction and these sorts of things that we know, or, your impending death for that matter. You can look at them from this perspective, and being able to step away from that involvement and have that perspective is just, I think, tremendously therapeutic, to help people come to terms with these things.
And on the evolution point, I'd say, the alternative theories are that we entered the plains and became bipedal, and that affected our brain size. Others, like cooking meat, for example. On a personal level, I think you can't compare those two to psychedelics in their profundity, in their ability to change the way you think. But of course, now these substances, until very recently, these substances have been largely stigmatized and relegated into the shadows. What do you think the effect is if the stoned ape theory is correct and we evolved in symbiosis with these plants? What do you think the effect has been in separating from them? And what do you think the impacts of this have been?
Well, first of all, I am not somebody that says that early psychedelic experiences in hominids were the only thing. I think it was a combination of complex interaction of factors, evolving in that environment, learning to use fire, learning to hunt, learning to fashion weapons and use them. All of that was also important, but I think the psychedelic experience might have been important for this, in that environment, for making people aware of this potentially unseen, but experienceable with the help of psychedelics, this unseen world, however they may have interpreted it, a world of spirits, a world of intelligences that they interacted with, that had information to impart, essentially. How did we get separated from that? Well, it depends on, Terence in Food of the Gods actually writes very intelligently about this. And when I talk about it, I tend to look at, more recent events, such as the rise of Christianity. But Terence talks about the dominator cultures and, through migrations and cultural interactions, these ecstasy-based matriarchal psychedelic religions were stamped out or suppressed. And the dominator cultures had a very different perspective, and the most recent and maybe most impactful dominator culture is Christianity. Christianity came along, and because it was the state religion, it was the dominating religion. It suppressed these mystery schools. And these other societies that were based on, that were basically nature worshipers, and Christianity. We got separated from it, at least in the Western world, primarily because of Christianity's teaching that nature has no value. They postulate afterworld and afterlife. And they suggest that you shouldn't value this life. They don't give you an incentive to value nature. It's all about your reward is in the next life. And so the message from Christianity is that nature, is something that we have every right to dominate and control and exploit, and because it doesn't matter. And so that fosters some very bad attitudes toward our relationship to nature. Essentially says we're separate from nature, we're superior to nature. Well, we're seeing the consequences of that attitude now in terms of the way we treat the planet and the way we treat each other and ourselves. This dominator attitude is. In some ways, most of the problems that we have can be traced to this separation, this estrangement from nature that has happened over the last few thousand years, whether it happened with the rise of Christianity or possibly, earlier than that. I mean, Terence even says that, if you go back further enough, he says, actually, the beginning, it began with agriculture. And our understanding that, we could exert that kind of control over the environment. We could grow plants, and that made it a lot easier to survive. So whenever it happened, it unfolded over several thousand years, and it had an effect of making us essentially feel that we're separate from nature and not part of it, and it encouraged this idea that we control it, that it exists to serve us. And that's exactly the opposite of the message you get from psychedelics, and especially in a contemporary context. I think one of the factors behind the resurgence in interest of psychedelics is that people are looking for meaningful experiences, and religion doesn't offer that anymore. If they ever did, for many people, people seek religion because they seek genuine, meaningful experiences, which maybe you could call those spiritual experiences. Most of the established religions, at least the Abrahamic religions, and the last thing they want is for somebody to have a genuine mystical experience, and that's the province of the priests and the shamans and all that. Ordinary schmucks like you and me, we're not privileged. So when we go outside the box to seek that, essentially we're heretics, and it's not encouraged. I think that in the contemporary era, people feel they long for meaningful experiences, and they're not finding them if they come from a religious background at all. These institutions are more or less hollowed out, and they're not places you can go for spiritual spiritual enlightenment. They're basically bludgeons to make people toe the line, make people conform to a certain perceived set of behaviors that's endorsed by the religion, but they don't really give you meaning in that sense. And I think that's one reason why younger people are increasingly rejecting religion, or rejecting organized religion in favor of spirituality, which has little to do with organized religion, and and are motivated to go, to seek their roots, essentially, to seek even the archaic roots. That's why people go to South America to take ayahuasca and that sort of thing. People, it's not thrill seeking. In general, it's not thrill seeking. These are sincere people who really feel that something's missing from their lives, and that maybe in the psychedelic experience they can find that. And many of them do, as you know. And so I think it's that sense of spiritual, impoverishment in a certain way that motivates people to do this.
What do you think of the analogy, and I'm sure this has been made many times, but of comparing psychedelics to the printing press and the democratization of information? So there was no longer the priests and the elites, quote unquote, that were reading to people and kind of conveying the information they want to convey. Individuals could all of a sudden read for themselves and interpret things for themselves. Do you think psychedelics have that same effect? And is that kind of what you're hinting at when you say it has been separate to people like you and I, and it has been kind of relegated to the shadows? Do you think there's an analogy to be made there between the printing press and psychedelics?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, psychedelics have democratized spirituality in that respect. And, with the proliferation of information that's available and the easy access to travel, I think that's been a factor. So this has been a positive effect of the internet, in a certain way. But everything like this, there's they're two-edged swords. I mean, there are positive aspects and potentially negative aspects. But I do think that we have more information about these psychedelics than ever before, and we have more access to them, at least until recently. But until COVID came along, anybody could get on a plane and go to South America and have an ayahuasca retreat or have these experiences, and usually to great benefit as themselves as individuals. And then there's the wider issues about what does this do to the cultures that are the stewards of the information and the traditions of the plants. Because usually Westerners come in to have these experiences, even though they have they approach it respectfully, but there's an invitation to, just the economic factors and the many factors that impinge on people essentially seeking out, I guess, since we don't find meaningful spiritual traditions in our own culture, we seek out meaningful spiritual traditions in other cultures, and we go seeking those. And the very fact that we seek them is going to change them, because there are economic factors. I mean, in traditional practices with ayahuasca, before there was any kind of ayahuasca tourism or anything like that, with ayahuasca being used as a medicine within the community, the shaman took ayahuasca, the doctor took it, not the patient, or sometimes the patient, but usually it was a diagnostic tool for the shaman. And it still is, but Westerners coming to South America to take ayahuasca, they're not going to settle for that. They want the actual experience. They're not going to sit around and watch the shaman do it, So, and that's okay. I mean, I think that what's happening right now with tourism and the sudden reemergence of psychedelics as almost respectable, stigmatized. They've been prohibited and marginalized for a long time. Now they're gaining respect again, and their potential for therapy is being recognized. And, drug tourism, the ayahuasca tourism and so on has good and bad benefits. But you have to look at this, I tend to look at this as a biologist, and I think from 30,000 foot level, this is just a further iteration of our coevolution with these plants, which has been going on for who knows how long, but possibly more than 1 million years. We've been co-evolving with these plants, and they're not finished with us, nor are we finished with them. Although, something that is a bit dismaying to me as I see psychedelics becoming commercialized and corporatized and developed essentially as pharmaceuticals, I think that risks leaving something very important behind. You can focus on the molecules and you can develop therapies around those, but it's very hard to rip these things out of their cultural context. You lose a lot if you try to do that. And so, and yet at the same time, obviously these substances can be important for medicine. They're important for mental health, and psychiatry as it's currently practiced is not that effective. In some ways it's kind of a joke. So here's a chance for psychiatry to redeem itself by integrating psychedelics into the practice, but they can't do that without reckoning back to the traditional ways that they were used. So I think the hopeful direction, which I would like to see happen, is a rediscovery of shamanic practices and psychotherapeutic practices, and create a fusion of these where the best of both can be somehow combined together. I don't think it works for most Westerners we can't imitate indigenous people. We can't become indigenous people. We're not indigenous everybody's indigenous to Earth, I suppose, but you know what I mean. We can't really go to a Native American culture and become a Native American. We can respect what they do. We can participate in their ceremonies, but we have to recognize we're going to be always outside that tradition, and that doesn't mean that, alliances can't be formed. I think indigenous people understand how tremendous treasure that is important to all of humanity, particularly in this time of crisis, because one of the big messages people get from psychedelics is the message about this estrangement from nature, what we have to do about it to overcome that, to get straight again, to get back into this reference frame where we acknowledge that, we're not the boss, right? I say in my lectures, you monkeys only think you're running things. That's what the ayahuasca has told me and tells a lot of people. And I think if you look at it, it's true. Nature runs things. If we need a reminder of that, I think COVID, has been a gift to our species, because it's, all right, you guys, you're not listening to ayahuasca, it's not getting out to enough people. So here's a broadcast message for the entire species. Hey, nature is the boss. We're calling the shots here, and so ultimately, I think that's a helpful thing, part of getting reoriented in the right way in our relationship with nature. What's going to come out of this, God only knows. There seem to be so many things changing, but clearly One of them is, reflected in the whole human rights thing and social justice and all of this as a result of all the protests. We've got to learn how to respect each other better. We've got to learn how to respect nature together, how to form symbiotic relations with nature so that everybody benefits, and thus does evolution advance, and these plants which make these molecules that just happen to fit the receptor sites that stimulate religious experiences and transcendent experiences. I mean, maybe this is just an evolutionary accident, but maybe not. Anyway, it's where we find ourselves. And I really think we've got to come together on all of these different fronts to create a synergy and a symbiosis that helps us move forward. We have got to realize our own limitations, and we also have to realize again that nature is in charge, and how can we form alliances with nature so that less emphasis on technology and development. I mean, I'm in favor of all of those things, but we have to have perspective, and I think our task is to internalize these messages that we get from psychedelics and become better partners with nature. I wouldn't even use the word stewards of nature. It's not our role to be a steward of nature, in that sense. But it is our role, in the sense that stewardship implies ownership and control. Being a partner with nature and actually saying, we're not running it. You're running it. Tell us what to do, whether through internalizing the message of psychedelics or otherwise. And obviously in that, we have to learn how to treat each other better too. I mean, that's, and people say, how can you be expected to nurture nature? You can't even nurture each other, and so we have enormous challenges. I'm convinced that somehow in here, psychedelics are an important part of the solution.
And given that they are becoming more, I guess, mainstream, you could say, that people are becoming more open-minded towards them. There was even a Netflix documentary, I think it was Have a Good Trip or something along those lines, with celebrities detailing their psychedelic experiences.
Yeah.
How do you think, now that they are becoming less taboo and less stigmatized, how do you think we should integrate them back into society? Should we try and replicate these indigenous, more shamanic contexts, or should it be a free-for-all? Should people be allowed to pick up mushrooms at their local dispensary and do them how they will?
I tend to lean toward that. I think that people should have access to these medicines, that they should not be regulated or prohibited in any way. And I think that the very idea that we as a species have the right to declare another species persona non grata and say it's prohibited, it should be wiped out. These things are not the smallpox virus. I mean, okay, maybe we should wipe out the smallpox virus. There are good arguments against doing even that, and in fact, that's actually not happened because of their, it's kept alive in various bioweapons, repositories around the world. But the idea that these plants should be prohibited is again just an example of this incredible arrogance we have in our relationship to nature. And lately I've been talking about we should assert very, very vigorously the right to symbiosis. Symbiosis is a basic human right Because we're talking about alliances with non-humans, it's a basic right of living things to enter into mutually beneficial partnerships with other species, whether plants, animals, fungi, or whatever. Not even for psychoactive purposes. Any plant that we form a relationship, a food plant, a drug plant, a dye plant, anything that we value is potentially a symbiotic alliance. And we should assert that symbiosis is a right of any organism. And the decriminalization movements that are going on in the States and Canada and probably other places in the world, I think is very, very hopeful sign. Things are changing. It's not going to happen clearly at the federal level, or maybe not immediately, but in various states, these decriminalization petitions and initiatives are happening. And I think that's definitely a hopeful sign, because what it says is that, what it makes possible is that there are places where these plants are not prohibited. And so it opens up the possibility, instead of going to South America or places where these plants are used by indigenous people, it's a possibility to bring the medicine to North America and work with indigenous people in both hemispheres to, within that context, bring them up to North America and have essentially community centers for psychedelic therapies, much like you find in South America in like the Peruvian retreat centers, except in that case, foreigners are coming and then they're being served by the indigenous people. And this would reverse the equation. There are lots of existing centers like that already, but they're underground. They're operating essentially illegal. Decriminalization affords the possibility that they can come out into the open, and every community could have a psychedelic therapy research center, or which would research, not even research, just a psychedelic therapy center, in which people would be able to come and have these experiences and maybe get other types of therapies as well. They would look like spas, not like clinics. They would be places you could go and have these experiences, and also maybe do a little yoga, meditation, learn about nutrition, permaculture, all of these things. Sort of a localized nexus for these practices, and in that respect, instantiation of the mystery schools idea. Every community should have a mystery school, and that can be a center. And then you can reverse this equation of the migration of foreigners to South America to have the experience, to they don't have to do that. They work with indigenous people to produce the medicines, find ways to export it to these centers, and everybody benefits. So that's kind of where I would like to see it go.
Do you see, obviously cannabis is becoming legalized at a pretty rapid pace. Do you see, and it's also being integrated in a similar manner to what you're saying, in that you get cannabis yoga clinics and things of that nature. Obviously, cannabis in many ways is much more benign than psychedelics in its profundity or its general experiential impact. Do you see cannabis as kind of a Trojan horse of sorts, or it almost is like the gateway theory, in that once people acclimatized to cannabis and how normal it is and how you can integrate it in many ways into your life, do you think this is the first step to an integration with psychedelics?
I think cannabis is a good example of that. And because, as you say, cannabis is much more widely used, much less scary. People have the perception psychedelics seem a little more, a little more dangerous than cannabis and so on. People are more comfortable with cannabis. But I agree. I think the proliferation of cannabis and its rapid acceptance into society is a sign of this. And again, we shouldn't delude ourselves that we're doing this. Cannabis is doing this. And in the same way that we've seen this proliferation of ayahuasca, throughout the world now. Ayahuasca's escaped from the Amazon. It's being grown lots of places and so on. This is the agenda of these plants. Michael Pollan talks about how, plants that we have relationships, we think we're cultivating plants. They're cultivating us, and making us conform to their agenda. And I think that's because plants want to spread. That's what they do. They want to move into new, and so effectively cannabis, mushrooms, and ayahuasca have already conquered the world in a certain way, in that they're everywhere and people have access to them. And and there is the small matter that in a lot of places the access is still restricted. They're still illegal. But clearly these legal prohibitions are disappearing and increasingly in the world. And, I think 50 years from now, or maybe 10 or 20 years from now, if we live that long, but 10 or 20 years from now, we'll look back and say, well, the very idea that you can prohibit any plant, it was just ridiculous on the face of it, and hopefully it will lead to more access and proliferation of knowledge and, access to the experience and the proliferation of the knowledge, which has been growing in our society. Prohibition has never stopped that. And even though psychedelics were made illegal pretty much at the end of the 60s, that didn't stop people from using them, and it didn't stop people from learning how to use them. So within our culture, we have now a tradition. We have a body of knowledge of elders and people like me, I suppose, other people who are much more articulate than me, but we have a body of knowledge that can be shared widely via the internet about the right way to approach these substances and how to use them in a beneficial way, and that's relatively easy, because they, every substance, like, it's interesting in the conversation about drugs, there's a lot of projection onto the drugs, and certain autonomy or property is attributed to the drug when we really should be thinking about human behavior and how we use these drugs. The drugs are what they are. They have the properties that they have. Our choices about how to use those drugs, that's where the good or the bad comes in. So in that context, the solution to this is education, essentially. And real education, not bullshit, but real education. We live in a world that is saturated with drugs. We all use drugs, whether we know it or not. And moreover, we're made of drugs, which is why we use drugs, because we like what they do, And so we have to acknowledge this is a reality. And always the focus should be on how do we maximize the benefit, minimize the harms, and not pretend that there are not harms. There are harmful ways to use almost everything, also very beneficial and helpful ways to use almost any substance. So we have to get real and think clearly about our relationship with these substances, and we're really involved. We're really immersed in a kind of a global chemical ecology with these plants and substances. So we have to as we, and that again is, one function that these centers could fulfill. They could be a place where people could come and actually learn, how to form beneficial relationships. It could be a drug education center, whatever that means, but so much more than that. If you want people to use drugs beneficially, you have to teach them how to use them. And so to suggest that for a drug educator is a pretty radical notion, because the emphasis is always about teaching people not to use drugs, and then they listen to that and they go away and they go use drugs, because we have I think, an inherent impulse to seek out altered states of consciousness, and that should be encouraged.
I also think when it comes to the war on drugs, because there's been such a vacuum and a void of information surrounding these substances, a lot of young people, and I think I fall into this category as well, where I thought all these drugs were terrible. And then, of course, cannabis comes into the picture at some point, and you realize it's not that bad. And so you start wondering, what about all these other substances that I were told are horrible? And if cannabis isn't bad, maybe the others aren't bad. So it kind of is this curiosity by simply not knowing what's out there.
Yeah, this is the consequence of being fed bullshit when in your drug education, because you're told all these things about cannabis, how terrible it is. Then you look at it, investigate it for yourself. You find out not only is none of this true, but it has a lot of benefits. And the same thing with these other substances, and so we need to, number one, we need to take the emphasis off the drug. There is no such thing as a bad drug. I tell people there's no such thing as a bad drug. Plenty of bad ways to use drugs, and that's the thing. And that's so it seems obvious, but it's very hard to, get that perspective in conversations about drugs, because people, who are against drugs, whatever that means, it's easier to demonize the drug. What we need to be looking at is people's behavior. That's where everything, that's where all morality, originates, is in terms of our own behavior. Morality, good and evil, lives in the human heart, and technology, drugs are a kind of technology. Any technology could be used for good or used for evil. It's all about the decisions that we make in terms of how we're going to use or not use. Sometimes the best option is, the best decision is not to use a technology, even though we can. Things like nuclear weapons, but maybe nuclear weapons even have a role that's beneficial. It's hard to imagine one, but it's possible. And the thing is, we have to redirect our focus on essentially becoming more intelligent and more compassionate, and better people. And better people in the context of we're just one species that inhabits this planet. And so we have to acknowledge all the other species and, hopefully find ways that, at the moment we view ourselves as the dominant species, and we certainly are the dominant species in terms of the impact we're having on the planet. And so that's something we have to acknowledge and somehow deal with. We have to pull our elbows a little bit in and get realigned to what our true role in nature should be, because right now, we're the most dangerous species on the planet. We're the it's the first time that evolution has brought a species along that potentially could put an end to the entire enterprise if we wanted to. But at the same time, we're also the most promising species on the planet. We could develop if we develop the right clarity and moral compass and all this, we could turn this planet into paradise, and we could proliferate it throughout the galaxy if we wanted to. But of course, that's a ways away. But I hope that never happens until we get our heads screwed on. Well, if we can get our heads screwed on, then more power to you. But expanding into the galaxy as a way of escaping what a mess you've made of it on Earth is not a good thing.
No, it's not. I'm conscious of time, Dennis, and we've been almost at it for an hour, or just a bit over an hour, I should say. So I want to wrap up by asking you two final questions. The first is, what does the future hold for Dennis McKenna? What have you got in store for 2020, and where can people find you?
What you can do, the best way to do it, I've started this nonprofit, which you probably know about, called the McKenna Academy. That's the website. And the full name of it is the McKenna Academy for Natural Philosophy. And we're a nonprofit, and basically we conceive of it as a modern mystery school. I mean, this was my vision, but a lot of people have resonated with this, and I have an amazing bunch of really smart and heartful folks working on this. So that's the best way to connect with me and what I'm up to. And a lot of what we do is conferences and being an academy, our mission is education. We do conferences and retreats and that sort of thing. But because of COVID, we're not doing that now, but we're trying to develop a strong online presence. So we're doing virtual conferences and that kind of stuff. And if you visit there, you can see what we've been up to.
Awesome. And final question, any last words that you would like to leave behind? What wisdom would you pass on to others through your life experiences?
Basically, trust yourself, believe in yourself, learn to think for yourself. That's a lot of what the Academy is about. Is we want it to be a place where all sorts of ideas can come together and be considered and discussed in rational ways by people without necessarily telling, the problem with religion and many other institutions is they're very, their mission is to tell you what to think. They haven't said, and it's like the invitation is turn off your mind, stop thinking, just accept these tenets or beliefs and you'll be fine. Stop asking all these pesky questions. The mission of the McKenna Academy is exactly the opposite. We want to encourage people to learn how to think. And we welcome all the pesky questions, not that we pretend to have answers. We just want people to have active minds and really be thinking about this and sort of take within themselves the power to ponder the cosmos and our place within it and come up with your own intuition, your own answers to this. And be prepared to, in the classic Socratic way, discuss it all with your colleagues and peers. If you're way off track, there are plenty of people who are going to tell you, if you're full of shit. There are many people who will be happy to do that. And if you have great ideas, there are lots of people that will also jump on board with that. So that's the thing. I think life and our evolution and our relationship with these plants and all that is a continuous process of learning. And that's what the Academy is all about, to learn in ways that appeal to people and that are not the way it's always been done. Because, what passes for learning in a lot of academic contexts is not learning. It's more indoctrination. And so we're not into indoctrination.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dennis. It was a pleasure and an honor. As I said, massive fan of everything you've done. So keep it up and thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Louis. Very good interview. I'm sorry I did all the talking.
No, it's awesome. That's exactly how an interview should go.
Alrighty, that was Dennis McKenna, the very first guest of the Green Fund's CannaCast. You can find his work at McKenna Academy, which is mckenna.academy. That's the website. And I hope you guys enjoyed that and gained some insights from Dennis. I certainly did. And as I mentioned at the outset of the podcast, I've been listening to Dennis and his brother's work for many years now. So it was a huge honor for me to get to sit and speak with Dennis. And we've got a lot of other great guests yet to come that are lined up for the Green Fund's CannaCast. So make sure to stay tuned as we continue to discuss cannabis and the war on drugs more broadly, in depth, with some very high-profile, exciting individuals deep in the cannabis space. So stay tuned, and thank you for listening.